Eleanor Hartwell had spent 15 years caring for other people's children, watching from the shadows as wealth and privilege shaped lives she could never claim as her own. At 28, her hands were rough from mending clothes, and her back ached from sleeping in servants' quarters barely larger than closets. She had resigned herself to a life of invisible service, expecting nothing more than modest wages and the occasional kindness from employers who remembered her name. Then the letter arrived from a solicitor in Yorkshire, bearing news that seemed impossible. She had inherited Ravenshollow Castle from a great-aunt she never knew existed. The crumbling fortress had stood empty for decades, its halls echoing with secrets that stretched back centuries. Eleanor packed her single-worn suitcase and traveled north, determined to claim what was hers. But what would she discover in those forgotten rooms that had been sealed for so long? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The train journey north stretched endlessly through countryside that grew wilder with each passing mile. Eleanor pressed her face to the grimy window, watching as manicured estates gave way to rugged moorland dotted with stone walls that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. Her reflection stared back. Pale skin made paler by exhaustion, dark hair pulled severely back in the style demanded by her former employers, worn traveling dress that had seen better decades. At York Station, she hired a cart driven by a weathered man who introduced himself as Old Pete. His eyes widened when she mentioned Ravenshollow Castle, and he crossed himself quickly before taking her worn leather satchel. "Haven't had anyone ask for that place in nigh on 20 years, he muttered, helping her onto the wooden seat. Lady Catherine, God rest her soul, she was the last to live there proper. Kept to herself, she did. Folks in the village, they had their theories about what went on up there. The village of Ravenshollow nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills that seemed to cup it like protective hands. Stone cottages lined cobbled streets, their windows glowing warmly in the late afternoon light. Eleanor noticed how conversations stopped when Pete's cart rattled past, how faces appeared at windows and then quickly disappeared behind curtains. "There she be," Pete announced, pointing up a winding road that climbed steeply from the village. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Ravenshollow Castle rose from a rocky outcrop, like something from a fairy tale, its towers and battlements silhouetted against storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Even from this distance, she could see broken windows and ivy covering much of the structure, giving it an air of romantic decay that spoke of better days long past. The iron gates stood open, hanging from their hinges at odd angles. Pete's cart lurched up the overgrown drive between ancient oak trees whose branches formed a tunnel overhead. Weeds pushed through cracks in what had once been an impressive circular drive, and a fountain at its center had long since run dry, filled now with dead leaves and bird nests. "This is as far as I go," Pete declared, pulling the cart to a halt before the massive front doors. "You sure about this, miss? Village has rooms at the inn. Clean beds, warm fires, proper company." Eleanor clutched her satchel tighter. "This is my home now." Pete shook his head but helped her down, refusing the coins she offered for his trouble. "Lady Catherine always said blood would tell," he mumbled. "Said someone would come for this place eventually. Here." He pressed an ornate iron key into her palm, its metal warm, despite the cooling air. "She gave this to my father years ago. Told him to keep it safe for the rightful heir. Reckon that would be you." As Pete's cart disappeared down the drive, Eleanor stood alone before her inheritance. The castle loomed above her, 3 stories of weathered stone with towers that stretched even higher into the darkening sky. Gargoyles perched on corners, their faces worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain, yet somehow still managing to look disapproving. The front door was massive oak reinforced with iron bands, its surface carved with heraldic shields she didn't recognize. The key Pete had given her was equally ornate, its head shaped like a rose surrounded by thorns. It slid into the lock with surprising ease, turning with a click that echoed in the silence. The door swung open on hinges that groaned like living things in pain. Eleanor stepped into a vast entrance hall that took her breath away. A staircase curved gracefully to the upper floors, its banister carved from dark wood and topped with a rail worn smooth by countless hands. Portraits lined the walls, men and women in clothing from different eras, their eyes seeming to follow her movement. Dust motes danced in shafts of light streaming through tall windows, and the air held the scent of old roses, and something else she couldn't identify. Her footsteps echoed on marble floors as she moved deeper into the castle. Room after room revealed furniture draped in white sheets like ghosts frozen in time. A drawing room with windows facing west still held the last rays of sunlight, illuminating a grand piano whose keys had yellowed with age. The dining room's long table could seat 20, its surface reflecting the crystal chandelier that hung overhead like a frozen waterfall. As night fell, Eleanor found herself in what must have been the morning room, where she discovered oil lamps and matches waiting on the mantelpiece as if someone had expected her arrival. She lit several lamps, their warm glow pushing back shadows that seemed reluctant to retreat. In one corner, she found a basket containing bread, cheese, and wine that couldn't have been there long. Someone in the village had been preparing for her arrival. That night, she made a bed from sheets she found in a linen cupboard, choosing a small chamber on the second floor that felt less overwhelmed by the weight of history. As she lay in the narrow bed, listening to wind whistle through gaps in the stonework, Eleanor wondered what secrets these walls had witnessed, what stories the portraits in the hall might tell if they could speak. The ornate key rested on the bedside table, catching lamplight and throwing tiny shadows on the wall. Tomorrow she would begin exploring her inheritance properly. Tonight she was simply Eleanor Hartwell, former governess, lying in a castle that belonged to her by right of birth, a birth she was only beginning to understand. Morning light streamed through the tall windows of Eleanor's chosen chamber, revealing details that darkness had hidden. The room was smaller than the grand chambers she had glimpsed the night before, but it felt more welcoming somehow, as if it had been designed for comfort rather than display. A delicate writing desk sat beneath one window, its surface bearing the faint impressions of letters long since written and sent. Eleanor dressed quickly in her traveling clothes, eager to explore the castle properly in daylight. The corridors seemed less intimidating now, though no less mysterious. Portraits lined the walls at regular intervals, and she found herself stopping before each one, searching for family resemblances in the faces of strangers who shared her blood. The east wing drew her attention first, its windows catching the morning sun and filling the hallway with golden light. Here the portraits were older, the clothing more elaborate, speaking of wealth and position that stretched back centuries. She paused before one painting in particular, a woman in Elizabethan dress, her dark hair arranged in an intricate style, her eyes the same unusual shade of green that Eleanor saw each morning in her own mirror. But it was the portrait at the end of the hall that stopped her entirely. The woman in the painting couldn't have been much older than Eleanor herself, perhaps 30 at most. She wore a dress of deep burgundy silk that spoke of the mid-Victorian era, her dark hair arranged in the softer style that had become fashionable in the 1860s. But it was her face that made Eleanor gasp aloud. The resemblance was so striking that she might have been looking at her own reflection dressed in period costume. A small brass plaque at the bottom of the frame read, Lady Catherine Margaret Hartwell, 1838-1895. Eleanor sank onto a velvet bench that sat beneath the portrait, her legs suddenly unsteady. This was her great-aunt, the mysterious woman who had left her this vast inheritance, the woman who had lived alone in this castle for decades, becoming the subject of village speculation and whispered stories. Lady Catherine's painted eyes seemed to hold secrets, and there was something in her expression, a mixture of intelligence and sadness, that spoke of a life lived on her own terms, despite the constraints of her era. Around her neck hung a pendant that Eleanor couldn't quite make out in the painting's dim varnish, but it seemed to catch light even in the artwork, suggesting jewels of considerable value. Drawn by an impulse she couldn't explain, Eleanor climbed the narrow staircase that led to the tower room directly above the portrait gallery. The door at the top stood slightly ajar, as if inviting exploration. She pushed it open to reveal what had clearly been Lady Catherine's private chambers. The room was a revelation. Unlike the formal spaces below, this chamber spoke of personal taste and intellectual curiosity. Bookshelves lined every wall, filled with volumes in multiple languages. A telescope sat by the window, positioned to observe the night sky. Scientific instruments whose purposes Eleanor could only guess at occupied a table near the fireplace. Most intriguingly, easels holding half-finished paintings suggested artistic talents hidden from the world below. Eleanor moved carefully through the space, afraid to disturb anything. It felt as though Lady Catherine had simply stepped out for a walk and might return at any moment. A cup and saucer sat on the desk beside an opened book, a bookmark made from pressed flowers marking the page where reading had stopped forever. On the mantelpiece, Eleanor discovered something that made her heart race. A small silver frame held a photograph, not a formal portrait, but something more intimate. Lady Catherine stood in what appeared to be the castle's garden, her face bright with genuine laughter, her hair loose around her shoulders. But she was not alone. A man's arm was visible at the edge of the frame, suggesting a photographer who was more than just a servant hired for the occasion. Behind the photograph, Eleanor found something even more intriguing. A letter addressed in Lady Catherine's flowing script to "My dearest Eleanor," her own name, written in the hand of a woman who had died when Eleanor was barely 7 years old. With trembling fingers, she unfolded the paper and began to read. "My dear child, if you are reading this, then the inheritance has found its way to you as I always hoped it would. I have watched from afar as you grew from a spirited child into a young woman of remarkable strength and determination. The blood of our family runs true in your veins, and I believe you possess the courage to uncover the secrets I could never reveal in life. This castle holds more than rooms and furniture, more than the wealth that has accumulated over generations of careful stewardship. It holds the truth of who we are, who you are, and the legacy that is your birthright by more than mere law. Begin in the library, child. Look for the rose among the thorns, and let it guide you to understanding. Trust your instincts, for they are sharper than you know. And remember, we Hartwell women have never been content to live ordinary lives." The letter was signed with an elaborate C and sealed with wax that bore the impression of the same rose design Eleanor had noticed on the key as Eleanor folded the letter carefully. Her hands shaking with excitement and disbelief, she heard something that made her freeze. Footsteps in the corridor below, measured and deliberate. Someone else was in the castle. She moved quickly to the window, staying hidden behind the heavy curtains as she peered down at the courtyard below. A figure emerged from the main entrance, a woman in a dark cloak, moving with the confident stride of someone familiar with the castle's layout. As the figure reached the courtyard center, she turned to look up at the very window where Eleanor stood hidden. Even from this distance, Eleanor could see the woman's face clearly. She was perhaps 50, with graying hair and the kind of bearing that spoke of authority. More unsettling still, she raised one hand in what might have been a greeting, or perhaps a warning, before disappearing into the morning mist that clung to the castle walls. Eleanor remained at the window long after the woman had vanished, her mind racing with questions. Who had access to the castle? How long had they been coming here? And most importantly, were they friend or foe to the new mistress of Ravenshollow? Lady Catherine's letter crinkled softly as Eleanor folded it again, the paper warm from her nervous fingers. The mystery was deepening rather than clearing, and she was beginning to understand that inheriting this castle meant inheriting far more than she had ever imagined. Eleanor's curiosity about the mysterious woman drove her to venture into the village that afternoon. She needed supplies regardless: candles, food, perhaps some insight into the castle's recent history from people who had lived in its shadow for generations. The village of Ravenshollow seemed even smaller in daylight, its cobbled streets winding between cottages that looked as though they had grown from the very stones beneath them. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the scent of baking bread drifted from the bakery's open door. Yet Eleanor noticed how conversation ceased when she passed, how curtains twitched at windows as if the inhabitants were studying her every move. At the general store, a plump woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted apron greeted her with cautious warmth. "You'll be the new mistress up at the castle, then," she said, not really asking. "I'm Mrs. Pemberton. My late husband used to deliver goods there, back when Lady Catherine was still receiving visitors." "When did she stop receiving visitors?" Eleanor asked, selecting candles and basic provisions from the well-stocked shelves. Mrs. Pemberton's expression grew thoughtful. "Oh, must be 15 years now, maybe more. After the trouble with her gentleman friend, she became quite the recluse. Though I shouldn't speak of such things to a young lady." Eleanor's pulse quickened, remembering the photograph with the mysterious man's arm visible at the edge. "What sort of trouble?" "Well," Mrs. Pemberton leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He was married, you see. A lord from down south with a wife and children. The scandal nearly destroyed both families when it came to light. He stopped coming to the castle, and Lady Catherine, well, she was never quite the same after." As Eleanor prepared to leave, Mrs. Pemberton pressed a wrapped loaf of fresh bread into her hands. "Take this, dear, and if you need anything at all, you just come down to the village. We look after our own here." The warmth in her voice made Eleanor's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. It had been so long since anyone had offered care without expecting service in return. On her way back to the castle, Eleanor noticed a forge at the village's edge. its chimney sending sparks into the afternoon air. The rhythmic sound of hammer on anvil drew her closer, and she found herself watching through the open doorway as a man worked at shaping hot iron. He was perhaps 35, with the broad shoulders and strong arms that came from years of physical labor. His dark hair was damp with perspiration, and when he looked up from his work, Eleanor found herself staring into the warmest brown eyes she had ever seen. There was intelligence there and kindness, and something else that made her heart skip unexpectedly. "You must be Lady Catherine's heir," he said, setting down his hammer and wiping his hands on a leather apron. His voice carried the local accent but was refined by education. "I'm Thomas Ashford. My family has done metalwork for the castle for 3 generations. Eleanor Hartwell," she replied, surprised by how natural it felt to claim the Hartwell name. "I'm pleased to meet you, Mr. Ashford. Thomas, please. And welcome to Ravenshollow." His smile was genuine, without the wariness she had encountered elsewhere in the village. "I've been maintaining the castle's gates and hardware these past years, keeping things in good repair for when the rightful owner returned." "You knew I would come?" Thomas's expression grew thoughtful. "Lady Catherine always said someone would. She used to tell my father, 'The castle will know its mistress when she arrives.' We thought it was just the fanciful talk of a lonely woman, but—" he gestured toward her with paint-stained fingers. "You have the look of her about you. The same bearing. The same way of holding your head when you're thinking." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks at his observation. "Did you know her well?" "As well as anyone in the village, I suppose. She was a remarkable woman, far more educated than most gentlemen of her time. She used to bring me books about metallurgy and engineering, things I never could have afforded on a blacksmith's wages. Said knowledge should never be hoarded by those who happen to be born to wealth." He moved to a cabinet and withdrew a leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed with age. "She kept careful records of all work done on the castle, all expenses paid. Look here." He opened the book to reveal columns of figures in Lady Catherine's precise handwriting. Even after she became reclusive, she maintained everything through intermediaries. "This castle has been waiting for you, Miss Hartwell. Every stone, every timber, every pane of glass has been preserved for your arrival." Eleanor studied the ledger, amazed by the meticulous care evident in every entry. The amounts were substantial, far more than simple maintenance would require. Lady Catherine had been ensuring the castle would be perfect for her unknown heir. "Thomas," she said slowly, an idea forming in her mind. "Would you be willing to help me understand what I've inherited? Not just the building, but the history? The secrets?" His eyes met hers, and she saw something kindle there. Interest, perhaps even excitement. "I'd be honored to help, Miss Hartwell. Lady Catherine always said this place had stories to tell to those brave enough to listen." As Eleanor walked back to the castle, Thomas's words echoed in her mind. The village had accepted her more readily than she had expected, and she had found an ally in the blacksmith whose family had served hers for generations. More than an ally, if she were honest about the way her pulse had quickened when he smiled, but it was the ledger's revelations that occupied most of her thoughts. Lady Catherine had spent a fortune maintaining the castle for an heir she might never meet. The dedication spoke of secrets worth preserving, of a legacy that extended far beyond simple property inheritance. That evening, as Eleanor lit candles throughout the castle's main rooms, she felt less like an intruder and more like someone coming home. The portraits on the walls seemed friendlier, the shadows less threatening, and somewhere in the back of her mind she could almost hear Lady Catherine's voice whispering encouragement. "Begin in the library, child. Look for the rose among the thorns." Lady Catherine's cryptic reference to the library haunted Eleanor's dreams that night. She woke before dawn, unable to shake the feeling that time was somehow precious, that delays might cost her opportunities she couldn't afford to lose. After a simple breakfast of bread and tea, she set out to locate the castle's library. The ground floor yielded nothing but formal rooms and servants' quarters. The second floor housed bedrooms and Lady Catherine's tower chamber. It wasn't until Eleanor climbed to the third floor that she discovered a corridor she had missed in her previous explorations, one that seemed deliberately hidden behind a tapestry depicting a medieval hunt scene. The corridor was narrower than the others, lit by small windows that cast strange patterns on the stone walls. At its end stood a heavy oak door bound with iron, its surface carved with the now familiar rose motif. Eleanor's inherited key turned easily in the lock, and the door swung open to reveal a sight that took her breath away. The library stretched the entire length of the castle's north wing, its vaulted ceiling supported by graceful stone arches. Shelves reached from floor to ceiling, filled with thousands of volumes in leather bindings that spoke of age and careful preservation. Tall windows provided natural light during the day, while candelabras positioned throughout the room could illuminate the space for evening reading. But it was the sheer scope of knowledge represented here that truly amazed Eleanor. These were not the typical volumes one might expect in a country estate's library, collections of poetry, novels, and hunting journals. Instead, she found treatises on natural philosophy, books on chemistry and botanical sciences, mathematical texts that made her head spin with their complexity. Many were in languages she couldn't read: Latin, German, French, and others she couldn't even identify. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with papers, notebooks, and scientific instruments. Eleanor approached it carefully, as if she were entering a sacred space. The papers were covered with Lady Catherine's handwriting: notes, calculations, sketches of plants, and chemical formulas. It became clear that Lady Catherine had not simply collected books. She had been conducting serious scientific research. One notebook lay open, its pages filled with detailed observations about plant breeding techniques. Eleanor read with growing fascination about experiments in cross-pollination, notes about soil composition, and theories about how certain plant characteristics could be enhanced through careful selection. The work was far more advanced than anything Eleanor had encountered in her limited education. "Look for the rose among the thorns," she murmured, remembering Lady Catherine's instruction. She began a systematic search of the library, looking for anything that might relate to roses or thorns in a literal or metaphorical sense. It was behind a section of botanical texts that Eleanor found what she was looking for. The bookshelf itself seemed ordinary enough, but when she pulled on a volume titled "The Cultivation of Heritage Roses," the entire section swung inward like a door, revealing a hidden chamber beyond. Eleanor's heart raced as she stepped through the opening. Oil lamps flickered to life automatically, some mechanism she didn't understand responding to her presence. The hidden room was smaller than the main library, but no less impressive. Here were the truly precious volumes. Books so old their bindings were held together with silk ties. Manuscripts written by hand on vellum that seemed to glow in the lamplight. But it was the center of the room that drew her attention. A reading table held a single book, bound in midnight blue leather and locked with a small silver clasp. Beside it lay an ornate silver key, its head shaped like a thorned rose, clearly meant to open the mysterious volume. Eleanor lifted the key with trembling fingers. It was warm to the touch, as if it had been waiting in someone's hand rather than lying on a cold table. The lock opened with a soft click, and she carefully lifted the book's cover. The first page bore an inscription in Lady Catherine's handwriting: "For Eleanor Margaret Hartwell, who will understand what others could not." What followed were pages that would change Eleanor's understanding of her inheritance entirely. The book was Lady Catherine's private journal, but also something more, a complete record of discoveries that had made the Hartwell family, quietly wealthy for generations. Eleanor read of experiments in plant breeding that had produced varieties of exceptional beauty and hardiness, specimens that commanded enormous prices from collectors around the world. She learned of chemical processes extracted from common plants that had applications in medicine and industry, formulas that generated steady income through carefully managed patents. Most remarkably, she discovered that Lady Catherine had been conducting correspondence with some of the most brilliant minds of her era. Letters from scientists, inventors, and scholars filled the journal's pages, revealing a network of intellectual exchange that had placed Lady Catherine at the center of significant scientific discoveries. One entry made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. The formula for the new rose preservation technique is complete. When properly applied, it extends the blooming season by months rather than weeks, and preserves the flower's essence even when cut. Lord Pembroke has offered £1,000 for exclusive rights to the process, but I believe we can command far more from the commercial growers in Holland. Eleanor will need this income when she comes to claim her inheritance. The date on the entry was from 15 years ago, when Eleanor had been barely 13 and working as a junior housemaid in London. Lady Catherine had been planning for her future even then, preparing wealth and security for a great niece she had never met, but somehow knew would one day need both. Page after page revealed similar entries: innovations in agriculture, discoveries in natural chemistry, investments managed through intermediaries that had grown into substantial holdings. Lady Catherine had not simply been an eccentric spinster living alone in a castle. She had been a brilliant scientist and shrewd businesswoman, accumulating wealth and knowledge that now belonged to Eleanor. As afternoon light faded from the hidden chamber's small window, Eleanor closed the journal with reverence. She understood now why Lady Catherine had lived as a recluse, why the villagers spoke of her with a mixture of respect and puzzlement. The woman had been decades ahead of her time, pursuing knowledge and independence in ways that society would never have accepted openly. The journal's final entry was dated just days before Lady Catherine's death. "She is ready now, my Eleanor. The reports from London tell me she has grown strong despite hardship, kind despite neglect, intelligent despite limited schooling. She will understand what this inheritance truly means, and she will have the courage to use it wisely. The rose garden awaits its new keeper." Eleanor held the journal against her chest, feeling the weight of legacy and responsibility settling on her shoulders, like a mantle she was finally ready to wear. The conservatory lay at the castle's southern exposure, accessible through French doors from what had once been the morning room. Eleanor had glimpsed it during her initial exploration, but had been too overwhelmed by the castle's vastness to investigate properly. Now, armed with knowledge from Lady Catherine's journal, she approached the glass structure with new understanding. The conservatory was larger than she had initially realized, its iron framework supporting panels of glass that rose in graceful curves toward a peaked roof. Many panes were cracked or missing entirely, allowing ivy and wild vines to creep inside, but the basic structure remained sound. What captured Eleanor's attention, however, were the plants that had somehow survived decades of neglect. Exotic specimens that should have perished in England's harsh winters continued to thrive in the protected environment. Palm fronds reached toward the glass ceiling, their trunks thick with age. Orchids bloomed in impossible colors along the walls, their delicate petals proof of careful breeding. Most intriguing of all were the roses, varieties Eleanor had never seen, with blooms that seemed to shimmer in the filtered light. Following a brick pathway that wound through the overgrown interior, Eleanor discovered that the conservatory was far more complex than it appeared from outside. Hidden beneath trailing vines was a second level, accessible by wrought iron stairs that curved gracefully upward. More remarkable still, she found a staircase that descended below ground level, leading to what appeared to be a root cellar, but revealed itself to be something far more sophisticated. The underground chamber was Lady Catherine's true laboratory. Unlike the scholarly retreat of the hidden library, this space was designed for practical experimentation. Workbenches lined the walls, equipped with glass vessels, distillation apparatus, and measuring devices that spoke of serious scientific work. Oil lamps provided warm light, and Eleanor noticed that ventilation shafts carried fresh air from above, suggesting careful planning for safety during chemical experiments. On the main workbench, Eleanor found Lady Catherine's experimental notes arranged as if she had been working just hours before. The handwriting was more hurried here, the excitement of discovery evident in hastily scrawled observations. One notebook lay open, to a page titled "The Crystal Prism Method," illustrated with detailed diagrams of an optical device Eleanor didn't recognize. She searched the laboratory until she found it, a crystal prism mounted in an adjustable brass frame, positioned to catch and redirect light from a small window set high in the wall. When Eleanor aligned it properly, sunlight streaming through the crystal created a spectrum that fell precisely on a collection of glass vials arranged on the adjacent bench. The vials contained various plant extracts, their colors ranging from pale gold to deep emerald. According to the notebook, each extract had been prepared using specific flowers and leaves, then concentrated through the crystal prism method. The focused light somehow intensified the natural properties of the plant materials, creating essences of remarkable potency. Eleanor read Lady Catherine's notes with growing excitement. The rose preservation technique mentioned in the journal was based on one of these concentrated essences. When applied to cut flowers, it extended their lifespan dramatically while intensifying their natural fragrance. Commercial applications were obvious. Florists would pay handsomely for such a product, and the wealthy would spare no expense to keep their gardens blooming longer. But the rose essence was only the beginning. Lady Catherine had developed similar concentrates from dozens of plants, each with unique properties. Some enhanced the growth rate of vegetables, allowing multiple harvests per season. Others served as natural pesticides that protected crops without the harsh chemicals that were becoming common in commercial agriculture. A few had medicinal applications that Eleanor could barely understand but recognized as potentially valuable. The laboratory's crowning achievement stood in an alcove near the back wall, a device that combined the crystal prism method with precise temperature control and measured chemical additions. Lady Catherine's notes described it as the apparatus for commercial production, capable of processing large quantities of plant material into concentrated essences. Eleanor found detailed records of income generated by these innovations. Through intermediaries, Lady Catherine had sold her discoveries to agricultural colleges, commercial growers, and private collectors throughout Europe. The profits had been substantial, carefully invested in properties and businesses that continued generating wealth long after the initial discoveries. More than the money, however, Eleanor was struck by Lady Catherine's dedication to advancing human knowledge. Letters from grateful farmers whose crops had flourished using her methods filled one drawer. Thank you notes from botanists who had successfully preserved rare specimens using her techniques occupied another. Lady Catherine had used her scientific gifts not just for personal gain but for the betterment of others. One letter particularly moved. Eleanor, a note from a widow in Scotland, whose small garden had fed her children through a difficult winter. Thanks to Lady Catherine's growth enhancement formula, you have saved my family, the woman had written. Your kindness will never be forgotten. As Eleanor explored further, she discovered that the laboratory connected to the conservatory through a hidden door concealed behind hanging plants. The entire complex had been designed to appear as nothing more than a wealthy woman's hobby, while concealing serious scientific research that had implications far beyond casual gardening. In a final cabinet, Eleanor found something that made her gasp with delight. Dozens of glass vials contained seeds, not ordinary garden varieties, but specimens Lady Catherine had developed through careful breeding and experimentation. Each vial was labeled with notes about the plant's special properties, growing requirements, and potential applications. Here were roses that bloomed in colors that shouldn't exist in nature, vegetables that produced twice the normal yield, flowers that released fragrances only in moonlight. Lady Catherine had been creating new varieties of plants the way other people collected paintings or jewelry. The implications overwhelmed Eleanor as she stood in the underground laboratory. Surrounded by a lifetime's work in botanical innovation, she had inherited not just a castle and its contents, but a scientific legacy that could change how the world understood plant cultivation. The knowledge and equipment to continue Lady Catherine's work were here, waiting for someone with the vision to use them. Yet Eleanor also recognized the danger in such discoveries. In the wrong hands, Lady Catherine's formulas could be exploited for profit without regard for the greater good. The secrecy that had protected these innovations during Lady Catherine's lifetime would be even more crucial now. As she climbed back to the conservatory level, Eleanor understood why Lady Catherine had lived as a recluse. The woman had been protecting secrets that could revolutionize agriculture, medicine, and horticulture. Now that responsibility belonged to Eleanor, along with the challenge of deciding how best to use knowledge that could benefit the world, or harm it, depending on who controlled its application. Thomas arrived at the castle the next morning with tools and materials to repair several broken window frames in the conservatory. Eleanor had sent word through Mrs. Pemberton, requesting his help in restoring the glass house to working condition. She watched from the morning room as he examined the damaged structure, his practiced eye assessing what could be salvaged and what would need replacement. The ironwork is sound, he reported when she joined him among the overgrown plants. Victorian craftsmanship, built to last centuries. Most of the glass can be replaced easily enough, though some of these specialty panes might need to be ordered from London. As Thomas worked, Eleanor found herself studying him with new interest. His movements were economical and sure, speaking of years perfecting his craft. When he removed his jacket to work more freely, she noticed the breadth of his shoulders and the way his shirt strained across his back as he reached to examine the upper framework. Lady Catherine used to spend hours out here, Thomas said, unaware of her scrutiny. My father would deliver supplies and find her working with plants he'd never seen before. She had a gift for making things grow that shouldn't have survived in our climate. Eleanor's pulse quickened. Did she ever explain what she was doing? Not directly, but she'd sometimes ask my father to forge special tools, implements designed for very precise work with small specimens. And she ordered unusual materials through him, chemicals, and glass apparatus that had to come from scientific suppliers in London. Thomas climbed down from the ladder where he'd been examining the roof structure and found Eleanor standing very close. Their eyes met, and she felt that same flutter of attraction she'd experienced at his forge. This time he didn't look away immediately. Miss Hartwell, he said quietly, I hope you don't think me presumptuous, but I've been wondering about your plans for the castle. Will you be staying permanently?" The question surprised her with its personal undertone. I believe so. This feels more like home than anywhere I've ever lived. I'm glad to hear it." His smile was warm and genuine. "The village has felt incomplete without a Hartwell in residence. And He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "I find myself hoping for more opportunities to assist with the restoration." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I would welcome your help, Thomas. There's so much I need to understand about maintaining a property like this." As if her words had opened a door between them, Thomas began sharing stories about the castle that went beyond mere maintenance records. He spoke of summer evenings when Lady Catherine would walk the grounds, examining plants by moonlight, of winter mornings when smoke from unusual experiments would curl from the conservatory's chimney, of the careful way she had preserved everything, as if expecting someone important to arrive. "She used to tell my father that love was like tending a garden," Thomas said as they worked together to clear debris from the conservatory floor. "It required patience, dedication, and faith, that beauty would emerge from what seemed like ordinary soil." Eleanor found herself wondering if Thomas was speaking only about gardening. Their hands brushed as they reached for the same fallen branch, and neither pulled away immediately. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and the kind of tension that made her breath catch. "Thomas," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice what she was feeling. "I know," he said softly. "I feel it too." That afternoon, while Thomas worked on the window repairs, Eleanor returned to Lady Catherine's private chambers with new purpose. If her great-aunt had indeed been preparing for Eleanor's arrival, perhaps there were more personal messages waiting to be discovered. In a small secretary desk she hadn't thoroughly examined before, Eleanor found a hidden drawer secured with a tiny lock. The ornate key she'd been carrying opened it easily, revealing a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. The return address on the envelopes made her heart skip. Lord James Pemberton. Pemberton Hall, Surrey. The letters were love letters, passionate and eloquent, spanning several years in the 1860s. Lord James wrote of stolen moments during his visits to Yorkshire, of walks through the conservatory where Lady Catherine showed him botanical wonders, of his anguish at being trapped in a loveless marriage that society forbade him to dissolve. "My dearest Catherine," one letter began, "the days between my visits stretch like years. I find myself dreaming of your voice, your laughter, the way your eyes light with intelligence when you explain your latest discoveries. Would that I were free to offer you the life you deserve, the partnership your brilliant mind requires." Eleanor read with growing sadness as the letters revealed the tragedy of Lady Catherine's love affair. Lord James was clearly devoted to her, but bound by duty to a wife he had married for family alliances rather than affection. Lady Catherine's responses, copies of which she had kept, showed equal passion, tempered by realistic acceptance of their impossible situation. The final letters in the bundle were the most heartbreaking. Lord James wrote of his wife's illness, his hope that her death might free him to marry Catherine properly. But Lady Catherine's response was firm. Too much scandal had already touched both their reputations. Even if he were widowed, society would never accept their union. She would not become the woman who had destroyed a family, regardless of the technicalities of timing. "I release you from any obligation to me," Lady Catherine had written. "Find happiness with someone who can share your life openly. I will treasure what we had, and find contentment in my work, my studies, and the knowledge that I was loved completely, if briefly, by a man of honor." The correspondence ended there. Eleanor found records indicating that Lord James had indeed remarried within 2 years of his wife's death, a younger woman of impeccable reputation, who bore him the son his first marriage had failed to produce. As Eleanor carefully retied the ribbon around the letters, she felt profound sympathy for Lady Catherine's sacrifice. The woman had chosen solitude rather than compromise her principles, devoting herself to scientific pursuits that brought advancement to others, even as they failed to fill the emptiness in her own life. A soft knock at the chamber door interrupted her thoughts. Thomas stood in the doorway, his work shirt rolled to his elbows, his face slightly flushed from physical exertion. "I've finished the emergency repairs," he said. "The conservatory is secure for now, though it will need more extensive work to fully restore it." Eleanor stood, suddenly very aware of her appearance after a day of exploring dusty rooms and handling old papers. "Thank you, Thomas. I don't know how to repay your kindness." "Your company is payment enough," he replied, then seemed surprised by his own boldness. They stood looking at each other in the golden light, streaming through Lady Catherine's windows. And Eleanor realized that, unlike her great-aunt, she might not have to choose between love and independence. Times were changing, and perhaps she could find a man who would value her mind as much as her heart. The thought both thrilled and terrified her, opening possibilities she had never dared to imagine during her years of service to other families. Sleep eluded Eleanor that night, her mind churning with everything she had discovered about Lady Catherine's secret life. She found herself walking the castle's corridors in her nightgown and robe, drawn by an inexplicable restlessness that seemed to pull her toward unexplored corners of her inheritance. The grandfather clock in the entrance hall chimed midnight as Eleanor made her way to the west wing, an area she had barely examined in her systematic exploration of the castle. Here the corridors were narrower, the ceilings lower, suggesting these had been the servants' quarters in earlier times. But Lady Catherine had lived alone except for minimal staff, so what purpose had these rooms served in recent decades? A sound made her freeze, a soft creaking that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Eleanor held her candle higher, casting flickering shadows that danced along the stone walls. The sound came again, rhythmic and deliberate, like footsteps but not quite matching human movement. Following the sound, Eleanor found herself before a door she hadn't noticed during daylight exploration. It was smaller than the others, almost hidden in an alcove that would be easy to overlook. The handle turned easily under her touch, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled downward into darkness. The creaking sound was clearer now, accompanied by a faint whistling of air that suggested movement below. Eleanor descended carefully, her candle flame guttering in the draught. The staircase ended at a small chamber that took her breath away with its ingenuity. The room housed an elaborate mechanical device, unlike anything Eleanor had ever seen. Gears and pulleys connected to a series of weighted pendulums that swung in careful rhythm, their movement creating the creaking sounds she had heard above. But this was no ordinary clock mechanism. Pipes and tubes extended from the central apparatus in all directions, disappearing into the walls and ceiling. Eleanor studied the device with growing amazement. Lady Catherine's precise handwriting labeled various components: ventilation control, temperature regulation, humidity management. This was a climate control system for the entire castle, designed to maintain optimal conditions for the scientific work conducted in the conservatory and laboratory. But it was more than that. Eleanor discovered that the mechanical system also operated the automatic lighting she had noticed in the hidden library. Oil reservoirs connected to a network of tubes could deliver fuel to lamps throughout the castle at the throw of a lever. Lady Catherine had created a centralized system for managing her entire domestic environment, decades before such innovations became common. In one corner of the mechanical room, Eleanor found something that made her heart race with excitement. A large compass, its face decorated with intricate engravings, sat mounted in a brass stand. But this was no ordinary navigation instrument. The needle, instead of pointing north, swung slowly to indicate different directions as she moved around the room. Lady Catherine's notes, scattered on a nearby workbench, explained the compass's unusual behavior. It had been modified to detect magnetic anomalies, specifically, the presence of large metal deposits underground. The needle's movement indicated the direction of significant metallic masses buried beneath the castle. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read Lady Catherine's research into the castle's foundations. Historical records suggested that Ravenshollow had been built on the site of a much older structure, possibly a Roman settlement. The modified compass had detected what appeared to be a large metallic deposit directly beneath the castle's central courtyard, something too regular in shape to be a natural ore deposit. The treasure of Ravenshollow, Lady Catherine had written in her most recent notes. Not gold or silver as the legends claim, but something far more valuable, a repository of knowledge from those who came before. The Romans were master engineers. What they built to last the ages may still serve those wise enough to find it. Eleanor studied the compass readings Lady Catherine had recorded over several years. The woman had been methodically mapping the underground structure, creating detailed diagrams that showed chambers and passages extending beneath the entire castle complex. The largest chamber appeared to be directly under the courtyard, accessible through what Lady Catherine believed was an entrance hidden somewhere in the castle's foundation. As Eleanor absorbed this information, she heard new sounds from above, footsteps in the corridor she had just left, moving with the confidence of someone familiar with the castle's layout. Her heart pounded as she realized she was trapped in the mechanical room with no other exit. And someone was moving through the castle who had no business being there. The footsteps paused at the top of the hidden staircase. Eleanor blew out her candle and pressed herself against the wall, hoping the darkness would conceal her presence. A voice drifted down the spiral stairs, a woman's voice, cultured and commanding. "I know you're down there, Eleanor Hartwell. We need to talk." Eleanor's breath caught. The voice belonged to the mysterious woman she had seen from Lady Catherine's window, the figure who had seemed to greet her from the courtyard. But how did this stranger know her name? And what gave her the right to enter the castle uninvited? "Come up, child. I've been waiting 30 years for this conversation, and I won't wait much longer." Against her better judgment, Eleanor relit her candle. The alternative, remaining hidden while this woman searched the castle, seemed far worse than confronting whatever threat awaited above. She climbed the spiral staircase slowly, her free hand trailing along the stone wall for balance. The woman waited in the corridor, and Eleanor's first clear look at her was reassuring rather than threatening. She appeared to be in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and clothing that spoke of wealth without ostentation. Most importantly, her eyes held intelligence and warmth rather than malice. "Lady Margaret Thornfield." The woman introduced herself with a slight curtsy. "I was Catherine's closest friend and latterly her business partner. I've been managing certain aspects of your inheritance from London, waiting for you to arrive and prove yourself capable of understanding what you've truly inherited." Eleanor found her voice at last. "You've been watching me, protecting you," Lady Margaret corrected. "Catherine made me promise to ensure her heir was worthy of the trust she was placing in them. Not worthy in terms of bloodline, that was never in question. Worthy in terms of character, intelligence, and discretion." Eleanor studied this elegant stranger who claimed friendship with Lady Catherine. "What kind of protection do I need?" Lady Margaret's expression grew serious. "The kind that comes from having secrets worth killing for, and inheriting them at a time when certain people have been waiting decades for Catherine's death to give them access to this castle." The mechanical room's rhythmic creaking continued below them, marking time like a heartbeat in the castle's hidden depths. Eleanor realized that her midnight exploration had led her to discoveries far beyond. Architectural curiosities, she had stumbled into mysteries that connected her inheritance to dangers she was only beginning to understand. "Monty." Margaret led Eleanor to the morning room, where she had somehow prepared tea service as if she belonged in the castle. The sight of familiar china and properly arranged refreshments in her own dining room unsettled Eleanor more than any supernatural occurrence might have. 30 years, Eleanor said. Settling into the chair Lady Margaret indicated. "You said you've been waiting 30 years. What happened 30 years ago?" Catherine discovered something that changed everything. Lady Margaret poured tea with practiced grace, her movements speaking of aristocratic upbringing. "The compass you found tonight was her key to unlocking the castle's greatest secret. But when she realized the implications of what lay beneath Ravenshollow, she knew she couldn't explore it alone." Eleanor accepted the teacup, noting how Lady Margaret handled the delicate china as if she had used it countless times before. "You helped her explore the underground chambers? We never reached them." Lady Margaret's expression darkened. "Others became aware of Catherine's research. People with far less noble intentions than advancing scientific knowledge. Catherine was forced to seal the entrance and hide all evidence of what she had discovered." The older woman moved to the window, gazing out at the moonlit courtyard where Eleanor had seen her that first morning. "Your great-aunt was brilliant, but she was also naive about human nature. She believed that if she kept her discoveries secret, she could protect them from exploitation. She didn't understand that secrecy itself can be a beacon to those who profit from other people's innovations." "What kind of people?" Eleanor asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "Industrial spies, patent thieves, men who built fortunes by stealing the work of others and claiming it as their own." Lady Margaret returned to her seat, her tea untouched. Catherine's botanical innovations were making her wealthy, but they were also making her enemies. People who wanted to know how a spinster in Yorkshire was producing agricultural miracles that their own scientists couldn't replicate. Eleanor thought of the complex laboratory beneath the conservatory, the detailed records of successful experiments, the network of buyers throughout Europe. Someone tried to steal her work? Someone tried to steal everything. Lady Margaret's voice carried old anger. They sent men to break into the castle, to search her papers, to intimidate her into selling her formulas at a fraction of their value. When direct theft failed, they tried legal challenges, claiming her patents were invalid because she was unmarried and therefore couldn't conduct business independently. The injustice of it made Eleanor's hands clench around her teacup. But she fought them? With everything she had. That's when she asked for my help. Lady Margaret smiled with obvious pride. I had resources Catherine lacked. Social connections, legal expertise, and most importantly, a husband whose name could appear on documents when gender became an obstacle. Eleanor began to understand. You became her business partner. Her shield, Lady Margaret corrected. We established a trading company in London, with all legal documents bearing my husband's name. Catherine's innovations were marketed through our firm, with profits flowing back to her through carefully structured arrangements that protected her identity. Lady Margaret rose and retrieved a leather portfolio from a side table. Eleanor hadn't noticed her place there. The arrangement continued after my husband's death 15 years ago. I've been managing Catherine's business interests ever since, waiting for her heir to prove capable of inheriting not just wealth, but the responsibility that comes with it. The portfolio contained documents that took Eleanor's breath away. Patent certificates in various names, all protecting Lady Catherine's innovations. Investment records showing substantial holdings in railways, mining operations, and manufacturing companies. Bank statements revealing accounts in London, Edinburgh, and even Paris, all generating steady income from Catherine's scientific discoveries. This is a fortune, Eleanor whispered, studying figures that dwarfed her wildest imaginings about her inheritance. It's also a target, Lady Margaret warned. The men who tried to steal Catherine's work 30 years ago are still alive, still watching, still waiting for an opportunity to claim what they believe should belong to them. Your arrival at Ravenshollow has been noted by people who have very long memories and very few scruples. Eleanor looked up from the documents, fear and excitement warring in her chest. What do they want exactly? The treasure vault, Lady Margaret said simply. Catherine's research convinced her that the Romans built a repository beneath this site, not for gold or silver, but for knowledge. Engineering texts, architectural plans, technological innovations that were lost when the empire fell. Catherine believed she had found evidence of Roman concrete formulations, water management systems, and construction techniques that modern builders would pay fortunes to understand. The implications staggered Eleanor. Roman engineering was legendary for its durability and sophistication. If such knowledge had been preserved and could be recovered, it would revolutionize modern construction and make whoever controlled it unimaginably wealthy. Catherine never opened the vault? Eleanor asked. She was afraid to. Not of physical danger, but of what would happen once such knowledge became public. She spent the last years of her life developing security, measures to protect the vault until someone worthy could be trusted with its contents. Lady Margaret reached across the table and took Eleanor's hands in hers. That someone is you, my dear. Catherine watched you from afar for years, studying reports about your character, your intelligence, your reaction to adversity. She chose you not just because you're family, but because she believed you would use such knowledge responsibly. Eleanor felt the weight of legacy settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. And if I'm not worthy, if I make the wrong choices, then treasures that have waited 2,000 years will wait longer, Lady Margaret said simply. But Catherine was rarely wrong about people. She saw in you the same qualities that made her capable of such remarkable discoveries: curiosity tempered by wisdom, ambition balanced by conscience. The older woman gathered the documents back into the portfolio. There's more to discuss, but you need time to absorb what I've told you. We'll meet again tomorrow night after you've had a chance to examine the family seal ring. Eleanor's eyes widened. How do you know about the ring? Lady Margaret smiled mysteriously. Catherine left very detailed instructions about your education in these matters. The ring will prove your legitimacy beyond any legal challenge, but it also serves a more practical purpose. It's the key to opening the vault itself. As Lady Margaret prepared to leave, Eleanor grasped her arm. How do I know I can trust you? How do I know you're not one of the people trying to steal Catherine's secrets? The older woman's expression grew tender. Because if I wanted to steal them, my dear child, I've had 30 years of opportunity to do so. I've been protecting your inheritance because Catherine was more than my business partner. She was the dearest friend I ever had, and I promised her that you would inherit not just wealth, but the chance to use it for good. After Lady Margaret disappeared into the night, as mysteriously as she had appeared, Eleanor sat in the morning room surrounded by the remnants of their tea service. The castle felt different now. Not just a grand inheritance, but a responsibility that connected her to centuries of accumulated knowledge and the burden of deciding how such power should be used. Eleanor spent the following morning searching for the family seal ring Lady Margaret had mentioned. She had assumed it would be with Lady Catherine's jewelry, but the collection in the tower chamber yielded nothing matching the description of an important signet ring. It was Thomas who solved the mystery when he arrived to continue work on the conservatory repairs. A ring with the family crest? He mused when Eleanor described what she was seeking. My grandfather used to speak of Lady Catherine's father wearing such a piece. Said it was the most beautiful example of the jeweler's art he'd ever seen. Heavy gold with the Hartwell rose carved in relief. Eleanor had been searching jewelry boxes when she should have been thinking about hiding places. Where would Lady Catherine keep something that important? Thomas set down his tools and considered the question seriously. If it were me, I'd want it somewhere safe but accessible. Somewhere that felt right for something with that kind of significance. Together, they returned to the portrait gallery, studying the painted faces of Eleanor's ancestors with new attention. It was Eleanor who noticed that the frame of Lady Catherine's portrait seemed slightly larger than necessary for the canvas it contained. Thomas, could you help me lift this down? The portrait was heavier than expected, and as they moved it carefully to a nearby table, Eleanor heard something shift within the frame. A careful examination revealed a hidden compartment behind the canvas, accessible through a nearly invisible panel in the ornate gilded frame. Inside, wrapped in midnight blue velvet, lay the most beautiful ring Eleanor had ever seen. The gold was warm and heavy, clearly ancient but perfectly preserved. The face bore the carved relief of a rose surrounded by thorns, so detailed that each petal and spine seemed to catch light independently. Around the band, Latin words were engraved in script so fine it must have required a master craftsman weeks to complete. Veritas et sapientia, Thomas read, his classical education proving useful. Truth and wisdom. Eleanor slipped the ring onto her right hand, surprised to find it fit perfectly. The weight felt natural, as if the ring had been waiting for her specifically. But more than its beauty or craftsmanship, she was struck by a sense of connection to the ancestors whose portraits surrounded them. It's magnificent, Thomas breathed, then caught himself admiring not just the ring but the hand that wore it. Their eyes met, and Eleanor felt that familiar flutter of attraction complicated now by her growing understanding of her true position in society. Thomas, she began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice her concerns about the vast gulf between her newfound status and his position as a village craftsman. I know what you're thinking, he said quietly. You're wondering how a blacksmith could possibly court a woman who wears rings like that one. Eleanor's cheeks burned with embarrassment at being read so easily. It's not about money or status. It's about everything this ring represents. The responsibility, the expectations. Thomas moved closer, his expression earnest. Lady Catherine never cared about such things. She judged people by their character, not their birth or wealth. And you, he reached out to touch her hand, the one wearing the ring. You're not the type of woman to let circumstance change who you are inside. Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of carriage wheels on gravel announced an unexpected visitor. Through the gallery windows, they watched an elegant black carriage approach the castle, its brass fittings gleaming in the afternoon sun. The driver wore livery Eleanor didn't recognize, and the passenger who emerged was a gentleman she had never seen before. He was perhaps 40, impeccably dressed in London fashion, with the kind of bearing that spoke of wealth and privilege. His hair was silver at the temples, and he moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to having doors opened for him. Most unsettling of all, he carried a leather portfolio that looked remarkably similar to the one Lady Margaret had shown Eleanor the night before. Thomas, Eleanor whispered, instinctively moving closer to him. I don't think this is a social call. The visitor's knock echoed through the castle with authoritative determination. Eleanor and Thomas exchanged glances before making their way to the entrance hall, Eleanor's hand unconsciously moving to cover the ring. The gentleman introduced himself with a formal bow that managed to seem more threat than courtesy. Miss Eleanor Hartwell, I presume? I am Reginald Hartwell, your cousin, and I believe the rightful heir to this estate. Eleanor's blood chilled. The man's resemblance to the portraits in the gallery was unmistakable. He shared the dark hair and strong jawline that marked the Hartwell lineage, but his eyes held a coldness that was entirely absent from Lady Catherine's painted features. I'm afraid there's been some confusion, Reginald continued, producing documents from his portfolio with practiced ease. Lady Catherine's will naming you as her heir was superseded by a more recent document, executed just weeks before her death, a document that names me as the sole beneficiary of her estate. Eleanor felt Thomas stiffen beside her. his protective instincts clearly aroused by this stranger's presumptuous manner. "I was not aware Lady Catherine had other living relatives," she managed to say, her voice steadier than she felt. "Distant relatives, perhaps, but legitimate nonetheless." Reginald's smile was sharp as a blade. "My grandfather was Lady Catherine's cousin, which makes my claim at least as valid as yours. More valid, actually, given this updated will." He handed Eleanor a document that appeared official in every detail. Proper legal language, witness signatures, even a wax seal that bore what looked like Lady Catherine's mark. But something felt wrong about it, something Eleanor couldn't quite identify. "You'll need to vacate the premises within a fortnight," Reginald continued, his tone suggesting the matter was already settled. "I'm prepared to be generous about your circumstances, of course. A woman of your background might find a position in my household should you require employment." The condescension in his voice made Eleanor's anger flare. "I think you'll find that my legal claim to this inheritance is quite secure, Mr. Hartwell. Any challenges will need to be addressed through proper channels." Reginald's expression darkened. "I had hoped to resolve this matter amicably, but if you insist on making difficulties, I'm prepared to take whatever steps prove necessary to claim what rightfully belongs to me." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Eleanor felt the weight of the signet ring on her finger, its solid presence reminding her that she was no longer a powerless governess who could be intimidated by men who believed wealth entitled them to anything they desired. "Good day, Mr. Hartwell," she said with dignity that would have made Lady Catherine proud. "Any further communication should be directed through my solicitor." After Reginald's carriage disappeared down the drive, Eleanor and Thomas stood in the entrance hall, both shaken by the encounter. "We need to examine that will more carefully," Thomas said. Something about it felt wrong. Eleanor nodded, her mind already racing through the implications of this challenge to her inheritance. She had found her place in the world only to have it threatened by a man whose claim seemed suspiciously convenient in its timing. The family seal ring seemed to grow heavier on her finger, its weight reminding her that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. Eleanor's first instinct was to ride immediately to the village and seek the counsel of the local solicitor. But Thomas suggested a more cautious approach. If this Reginald truly has legal standing, rushing into action might strengthen his position. "We need to understand what we're facing before we respond." That evening, Lady Margaret appeared at the castle, as if she had sensed Eleanor's distress. She examined Reginald's will by lamplight in the morning room, her expression growing increasingly grim as she studied the document's details. "This is expertly done," Lady Margaret admitted, setting the papers aside. "The signatures appear authentic at first glance, the legal language is correct, and the seal looks genuine. But there are subtle problems that suggest forgery." Eleanor leaned forward eagerly. "What kind of problems?" "The paper stock is wrong for the supposed date. This particular watermark wasn't introduced until 6 months after Catherine's death." Lady Margaret pointed to barely visible markings in the paper itself. "More significantly, the handwriting in the signature doesn't match Catherine's hand formation in her final months." Thomas frowned. "How would you know about her handwriting changing?" "Because she had developed arthritis in her dominant hand. I have letters from her final year that show the progression of the condition. Her normally flowing script became more cramped and angular. This signature shows none of those characteristics." Lady Margaret opened her own portfolio and produced documents that Eleanor recognized as authentic examples of Lady Catherine's correspondence. The difference was immediately apparent when compared to the disputed will. "There's another problem," Lady Margaret continued. "The witnesses listed on this will. One is supposedly James Morrison, Catherine's physician. But Dr. Morrison died in a riding accident 8 months before the date on this document." Eleanor felt relief flooding through her, followed immediately by anger at Reginald's attempted deception. "So the will is definitely fraudulent?" "Without question. But proving it in court will require more than our observations." Lady Margaret's expression grew serious. "Reginald must be quite desperate to attempt something so brazen. The question is why he believes he can succeed with such an obvious forgery." Thomas had been quiet during this examination, but now he spoke with concern evident in his voice. "Could he have accomplices? People in positions to support his claim?" "Almost certainly." Lady Margaret began pacing the room, her agitation showing for the first time since Eleanor had known her. Catherine mentioned receiving inquiries about her estate in recent years, lawyers asking about potential heirs, investigators making discreet inquiries in the village. Someone has been planning this challenge for quite some time. Eleanor thought about Reginald's confident manner, his assumption that she would simply accept his claim and retreat. He acted as though the outcome was already decided, as though he had resources I couldn't possibly match, which suggests he doesn't understand what he's actually challenging, Lady Margaret said with satisfaction. He knows about the castle and assumes that's the extent of the inheritance. He has no idea about the business interests, the patents, or the true scope of Catherine's wealth. This revelation gave Eleanor her first advantage in the developing conflict. If Reginald was unaware of the full inheritance, he would be unprepared for the legal resources Eleanor could marshal in her defense. "What do we do next?" Eleanor asked. Lady Margaret smiled with anticipatory pleasure. "We gather allies and evidence. I'll return to London immediately and engage the finest solicitors money can hire. Meanwhile, you need to secure the most important documents and treasures, in case Reginald attempts more direct action." The older woman's meaning was clear. Reginald might escalate beyond legal challenges if he felt sufficiently threatened. Eleanor needed to protect Lady Catherine's research and discoveries from theft or destruction. "There's someone else you should consider involving," Thomas suggested quietly. "Sarah Chen, Mrs. Chen's granddaughter from your former neighborhood. She's become a respected solicitor in London, specializing in estate law. Mrs. Pemberton mentioned that she grew up hearing stories about you from her grandmother." Eleanor remembered Sarah as a bright child who had shown remarkable determination to pursue education, despite the limitations placed on women. If she had indeed become a legal professional, she might provide assistance motivated by personal loyalty rather than merely professional obligation. "Excellent suggestion," Lady Margaret approved. Someone with personal investment in Eleanor's welfare could be invaluable, and a woman practicing law would understand the particular challenges Eleanor faces as a female property owner. They spent the next hour developing a comprehensive strategy. Lady Margaret would return to London and begin assembling legal support, while also investigating Reginald's background and potential conspirators. Eleanor would secure the castle's most important contents and document everything that might support her legal claim. Thomas would coordinate with trusted villagers to ensure Eleanor's safety and monitor any suspicious activity around the estate. "One more thing," Lady Margaret said, as she prepared to depart. "You mentioned that Reginald seemed to know exactly who you were when he arrived. That suggests surveillance. Someone has been watching the castle and reporting on your activities. Be very careful about who you trust and what conversations might be overheard." After Lady Margaret left, Eleanor and Thomas walked through the castle, identifying which items were most crucial to protect. The hidden laboratory beneath the conservatory needed to be secured, along with Lady Catherine's research journals and the mechanical compass that revealed the location of the underground vault. "We could move the most important documents to my family's house in the village," Thomas suggested. "My mother has a strong room where she stores valuable items for neighbors during the harvest season." Eleanor was touched by his offer to involve his family in protecting her inheritance. "Are you certain? This could become dangerous if Reginald is as ruthless as Lady Margaret suspects." Thomas stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. "Eleanor, I've watched you transform from a frightened woman hiding in other people's shadows to someone who belongs in this castle as if you were born to it. I won't let anyone take that away from you." The intensity in his voice made Eleanor's heart race. "Thomas, I know the differences in our stations might seem important to others," he continued, moving closer. "But out here, in this castle that belongs to you by right, none of that matters. What matters is that I've never met anyone like you, and I never will again." Eleanor found herself stepping into his embrace, drawn by his strength and the absolute certainty in his voice. When he kissed her, she understood that some connections transcend social conventions, that love, like inheritance, sometimes arrives in forms that society doesn't recognize, but the heart knows immediately. They broke apart when footsteps echoed in the corridor beyond, both suddenly aware that privacy was now a luxury they could no longer take for granted. Eleanor's fight for her inheritance had begun in earnest, and the stakes included not just wealth and property, but the future she had begun to envision with Thomas beside her. While Lady Margaret traveled to London to engage legal counsel, Eleanor spent the following days systematically cataloguing Lady Catherine's scientific legacy. What she discovered in the laboratory's deepest cabinets exceeded even her elevated expectations. Hidden behind false backs and filing drawers, Eleanor found certificates of patents registered not just in England, but throughout Europe and even in America. Lady Catherine's innovations had generated income streams from botanical societies in Germany, agricultural colleges in France, and commercial growers as far away as California. The scope of the scientific empire she had built from her Yorkshire castle was breathtaking. More intriguing still were the ongoing contracts Eleanor discovered. Lady Catherine's rose preservation formula was licensed to exclusive florists in Paris and Vienna, generating quarterly payments that alone would support Eleanor comfortably for life. Her enhanced growth compounds were being used by commercial farms throughout the Netherlands, with royalty payments structured to continue for decades. But it was a folder marked "Future Patents Pending" that truly revealed the extent of Eleanor's inheritance. Lady Catherine had been working on innovations that wouldn't be ready for commercial application for years to come. Disease-resistant crop varieties, natural pest deterrents, and soil enhancement techniques that could revolutionize agriculture worldwide. Thomas proved invaluable in helping Eleanor understand the mechanical aspects of Lady Catherine's innovations. His engineering knowledge, enhanced by years of reading the technical books Lady Catherine had provided, allowed him to explain devices and processes that would have been mysterious to someone without his background. "This apparatus here," Thomas said, examining a complex glass and metal construction in the laboratory's far corner. "It's designed to concentrate plant essences using both heat and pressure. But see these gauges? The precision required suggests she was working with compounds that needed exact measurements to avoid dangerous reactions." Eleanor followed his reasoning, as he pointed out safety features built into the equipment: pressure release valves, temperature monitoring devices, ventilation systems that would quickly clear the air of potentially harmful vapors. She wasn't just a botanist, Eleanor realized. She was a chemist working at the level of university researchers, but with practical applications, those academics never considered. Their investigation was interrupted by Mrs. Pemberton's arrival, bringing news from the village that made Eleanor's blood run cold. Reginald had taken rooms at the inn and was conducting what he called interviews with longtime residents, asking detailed questions about Lady Catherine's habits, visitors, and business dealings. "He's offering money for information," Mrs. Pemberton reported with obvious distress. "Gold sovereigns for anyone who can tell him about strange activities at the castle, unusual deliveries, or people who might have helped Lady Catherine hide valuable items." Eleanor's concern deepened when she learned that several villagers, including some she had trusted, had accepted Reginald's payment in exchange for sharing observations about the castle's recent activities. Her midnight explorations, Thomas's frequent visits, even Lady Margaret's mysterious appearances had all been noted and reported. "He knows far too much about what we've been doing," Eleanor told Thomas that evening as they secured the most sensitive documents in preparation for moving them to his family's house. "Someone is providing detailed intelligence about our activities." Thomas's jaw tightened with anger. "I can guess who. Old Pete who drove you from the station. He's been struggling financially since his horse went lame. And probably young Jim from the bakery. His gambling debts have been growing faster than his wages." The betrayal stung, but Eleanor recognized it as a harsh lesson about the vulnerability that came with wealth and status. People she had begun to trust as neighbors were willing to sell information about her private affairs to a stranger offering ready money. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a rider whose urgent pace suggested important news. Sarah Chen had traveled from London in response to Thomas's letter, bringing both legal expertise and disturbing intelligence about Reginald's background. "He's not just a distant cousin making an opportunistic claim," Sarah reported after examining the forged will. "My investigation revealed that Reginald Hartwell has been involved in similar inheritance disputes across England. He identifies wealthy elderly individuals with questionable family connections, then manufactures claims after their deaths." Eleanor felt sick as she absorbed this information. "You mean this isn't his first attempt to steal someone's inheritance?" "His third that I could document, and possibly more that haven't come to light." Sarah's expression was grim. "He has a network of forgers, corrupt witnesses, and legal accomplices who specialize in manufacturing inheritance claims. What's different about your case is the scale of wealth involved. This is by far his most ambitious attempt." Thomas leaned forward intently. "What happened in his previous cases?" "Mixed results. One case he won through intimidation. An elderly widow who lacked family support eventually agreed to a settlement rather than face prolonged legal battles. Another case he lost when the legitimate heir had resources to fight back effectively. But in that instance..." Sarah paused, her expression troubled. "What happened?" Eleanor demanded. "The legitimate heir died in what appeared to be a riding accident, shortly before the court case was to be decided. Reginald inherited by default as the only remaining claimant. The implication sent ice through Eleanor's veins. If Reginald had been willing to commit murder to secure a previous inheritance, her own life could be in genuine danger. We need to take immediate precautions, Sarah continued. I've brought legal documents from London that will freeze any claims against the estate until proper hearings can be conducted. But more importantly, Eleanor needs protection beyond what legal procedures can provide. Thomas stood abruptly, his protective instincts fully aroused. She's not staying alone in this castle another night. Not with Reginald in the village and strangers asking questions about her habits. Eleanor wanted to protest that she wouldn't be driven from her own home by threats. But the rational part of her mind recognized the wisdom in taking precautions. If Reginald had indeed killed to secure previous inheritances, overconfidence on her part could prove fatal. There's something else, Sarah added reluctantly. My sources in London suggest that Reginald isn't working alone on this venture. He has financial backing from individuals with substantial resources. People who believe Lady Catherine's inheritance includes assets far beyond the obvious property and investments. Eleanor's heart skipped as she realized the implications. Someone knew about Lady Catherine's scientific discoveries, possibly even about the Roman vault beneath the castle. Reginald's claim to the inheritance might be only the first step in a much larger scheme to acquire knowledge that could be worth millions. The family seal ring felt heavy on Eleanor's finger as she contemplated the magnitude of the forces arrayed against her. She had thought her greatest challenge would be proving herself worthy of Lady Catherine's legacy. Now she understood that first she would have to survive long enough to claim it. The confrontation Eleanor had been dreading came sooner than expected. Reginald arrived at the castle the next morning with 2 companions, men whose bearing and expensive clothing couldn't disguise the calculated menace in their eyes. Eleanor received them in the great hall, flanked by Thomas and Sarah. The family seal ring prominently displayed on her right hand. Miss Hartwell? Reginald began with false courtesy. I had hoped our previous conversation might have convinced you to accept the inevitable. Since you seem determined to contest what is clearly a legitimate claim, my associates and I felt a more direct discussion was warranted. The larger of Reginald's companions stepped forward slightly, his movement subtle but unmistakably threatening. Eleanor felt Thomas tense beside her, ready to act despite being outnumbered. Gentlemen, Sarah interjected with professional calm, any discussion of inheritance matters should be conducted through proper legal channels. I represent Miss Hartwell's interests, and I must inform you that we have obtained injunctions preventing any attempts to remove property from this estate pending formal hearings. Reginald's expression hardened. Legal proceedings can be unpredictable, Miss Chen, expensive, time-consuming, sometimes even dangerous for those who pursue them too aggressively. The threat was no longer subtle. Eleanor felt fear flutter in her stomach, but alongside it rose anger that anyone would dare intimidate her in her own home. The portraits of her ancestors seemed to watch from the walls, reminding her that Hartwell women had faced challenges before and survived. Mr. Hartwell, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, your attempts to manipulate and intimidate have failed. This estate belongs to me by legitimate inheritance, and I have both the documentation and the resources to prove it in any court in England. She held up her hand, letting the signet ring catch the morning light streaming through the tall windows. This ring has been worn by the rightful heirs of Ravenshollow for 3 centuries. It will not be surrendered to someone whose claim rests on forged documents and empty threats. Reginald's facade of civility cracked completely. You ignorant little governess! You have no idea what you're interfering with, what forces you're challenging. This inheritance involves matters far beyond your comprehension. Then perhaps you should enlighten me, Eleanor replied coldly. What exactly do you believe you're entitled to that would justify fraud and intimidation? One of Reginald's companions whispered something urgent in his ear, clearly trying to prevent him from revealing too much. But anger had made Reginald careless. Knowledge, you fool. Innovations that could revolutionize industry, agriculture, construction. Your precious great-aunt was sitting on discoveries that should belong to people with vision enough to use them properly. Eleanor exchanged glances with Thomas and Sarah. Reginald's words confirmed their suspicions. This wasn't simply about inheriting property, but about gaining control of Lady Catherine's scientific legacy. And you represent these visionary people? Eleanor asked with deliberate provocation. I represent investors with the resources to bring Catherine's discoveries to their full potential. Instead of hoarding knowledge in dusty laboratories, we would put it to use benefiting society and generating appropriate returns. Sarah stepped forward, her legal training evident in her precise questioning. What specific knowledge are you referring to, Mr. Hartwell? Nothing in the public record suggests innovations beyond typical agricultural improvements. Reginald realized he had revealed too much, but his anger drove him further. Don't pretend ignorance. We know about the patents, the international contracts, the ongoing royalties. More importantly, we know about the Roman vault. Eleanor's heart stopped. If Reginald knew about the underground chambers, his intelligence network was far more comprehensive than they had realized. The vault that your great-aunt was too timid to explore, Reginald continued with growing excitement. Ancient engineering knowledge that could transform modern construction. Concrete formulations, architectural techniques, water management systems that modern science is only beginning to understand. Thomas couldn't remain silent any longer. And you think you have the right to steal centuries of accumulated knowledge because you're willing to be more ruthless than the woman who preserved it? Reginald's larger companion moved forward threateningly, but Thomas stood his ground, his blacksmith's shoulders and arms making him a formidable opponent despite the odds. Enough discussion, Reginald declared. Miss Hartwell, you have 24 hours to reconsider your position. After that, my associates will take whatever measures prove necessary to secure what rightfully belongs to our investors. Eleanor stepped forward, drawing herself to her full height with dignity that would have made Lady Catherine proud. Mr. Hartwell, you are trespassing on my property and threatening the rightful owner of this estate. I suggest you leave immediately before I summon the constable. The constable? Reginald laughed harshly. My dear child, we have resources that extend far beyond your village connections. Legal obstacles can be removed. Witnesses can be discouraged from testifying, and accidents can befall those who prove too stubborn to accept reasonable settlements. Sarah produced a document from her portfolio with theatrical precision. Mr. Hartwell, you are now formally served with notice that any attempts to interfere with this estate or threaten its rightful owner will result in immediate criminal prosecution. We have witnesses to your threats, and I assure you that my legal connections extend well beyond village constables. As Reginald and his companions prepared to leave, he turned back with one final threat. You're making a grave mistake, Miss Hartwell. Literally grave, if you continue this foolish resistance. After they departed, Eleanor sank into a chair, the full weight of her danger finally settling on her. She was facing enemies with resources, connections, and a willingness to commit violence that her sheltered life had never prepared her to handle. Thomas knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. We won't let them hurt you, Eleanor. I promise you that. Sarah was already making notes, her legal mind analyzing the confrontation for evidence they could use. Actually, this meeting was extremely valuable. Reginald revealed knowledge he shouldn't possess, and made threats we can document. Most importantly, he confirmed that powerful investors are backing his claim. People who clearly know far more about Lady Catherine's work than they should. Eleanor looked around the great hall where her ancestors had faced their own challenges across the centuries. The portraits seemed to offer silent encouragement, reminding her that Hartwell blood had never yielded to intimidation. What do we do next? She asked. Sarah smiled with grim determination. We prove that some treasures are worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. That evening, as Eleanor, Thomas, and Sarah planned their defense strategy, Lady Margaret returned from London with news that transformed their understanding of the situation entirely. She arrived with a carriage, full of legal documents and a grim expression that spoke of discoveries more serious than they had anticipated. Reginald's investors aren't just wealthy, businessmen seeking profit, Lady Margaret announced without preamble. They're representatives of a consortium that has been systematically acquiring ancient knowledge from archaeological sites across Europe. They believe the Roman vault beneath this castle contains engineering secrets that could be worth millions. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. How could they know about the vault when we've only just learned of it ourselves? Because they've been searching for it longer than we realized. Lady Margaret spread maps across the morning room table, showing locations marked throughout England and the continent. This consortium has been funding excavations at Roman sites for decades, looking specifically for repositories of technical knowledge, rather than traditional treasures like gold or jewelry. Thomas studied the maps with growing alarm. They've found other sites like this one? 3 confirmed locations. Roman engineering libraries containing preserved manuscripts on concrete formulation, aqueduct construction, and architectural techniques. The knowledge they've recovered has already revolutionized several construction projects in Germany and France. Sarah leaned forward intently. And they believe Ravenshollow contains similar information? They believe it contains the most comprehensive collection they've yet discovered. Lady Margaret's voice carried a mixture of excitement and dread. Roman records suggest this site was a major engineering center, possibly the repository for technical knowledge from across northern Britain. Eleanor sank into a chair as the implications overwhelmed her. So Catherine's botanical discoveries were just the beginning. The real treasure is beneath our feet. Exactly. And now we understand why Reginald was willing to risk such an obvious forgery to claim the inheritance. His backers needed someone with a plausible legal claim to the property before they could begin excavation. Thomas's expression hardened. Which means they never intended to honor any agreement with Reginald. Once they had legal access to the property, he would become expendable. Lady Margaret nodded grimly. The consortium has a history of removing partners who become inconvenient. Reginald may not realize it, but he's already signed his own death warrant by accepting their backing. Eleanor found herself feeling almost sorry for her cousin. Despite his threats and attempted deception, he had thought he was orchestrating a clever inheritance fraud, but he was actually a pawn in a much larger and more dangerous game. What do we do with this information? Eleanor asked. Sarah was already making notes, her legal mind working through possibilities. We use it to turn Reginald against his backers. If we can make him understand that he's being manipulated, he might be willing to testify against the consortium in exchange for leniency. Lady Margaret looked skeptical. That assumes Reginald is rational enough to recognize his true situation. His behavior suggests he's too committed to his current course to accept evidence that contradicts it. Eleanor stood and began pacing, her mind racing through alternatives. The family seal ring felt warm on her finger, as if responding to her emotional state. Suddenly she stopped walking. Lady Margaret, you said the ring is the key to opening the vault. What if we opened it ourselves, before the consortium could gain access? The older woman's eyebrows rose. That would be extremely dangerous. We have no idea what preservation methods the Romans used, what condition the materials might be in after 2,000 years, or what security measures they might have installed. Thomas was studying the mechanical compass's readings that Eleanor had transcribed from Lady Catherine's notes. But we do know exactly where the entrance is located, and Catherine's research suggests the chamber is structurally sound. Eleanor felt excitement building despite the risks. If we could document what's in the vault, prove its historical significance, we might be able to get legal protection as a historic site. The consortium couldn't excavate if the government declared it a protected archaeological treasure. Sarah's eyes lit up with professional enthusiasm. That's brilliant. Historic preservation laws would take precedence over private property rights. But we would need irrefutable evidence of the vault's contents and significance. Lady Margaret was quiet for a long moment, considering the proposal. It would have to be done immediately, before Reginald's 24-hour deadline expires. Once his backers decide to take direct action, we'll lose any chance of controlling the situation. Eleanor felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. Opening the vault would be dangerous, possibly illegal, and certainly irreversible. But allowing the consortium to claim Lady Catherine's legacy seemed like a far worse betrayal of everything her great-aunt had worked to preserve. Thomas, she said quietly, are you willing to help me explore what lies beneath the castle? His answer was immediate and certain. I've been waiting my whole life for an adventure worthy of the woman I love. Eleanor's heart skipped at his declaration. Spoken so naturally it seemed like simple truth rather than romantic proclamation. She turned to Sarah and Lady Margaret. And you? Will you help us document whatever we find? Sarah nodded without hesitation. Someone needs to witness this for legal purposes, and I wouldn't miss the chance to see Roman engineering preserved in its original condition. Lady Margaret sighed deeply, but her expression showed resigned determination. Catherine always said the vault would reveal itself when the right person came to claim it. Perhaps tonight is the time she was waiting for. Eleanor looked around at the three people who had become not just allies, but friends in her fight to claim her inheritance. Together, they would venture into chambers that had been sealed for centuries, risking everything to preserve knowledge that rightfully belonged to the ages rather than to those who would exploit it for profit. The family seal ring seemed to pulse with warmth against her finger, as if Lady Catherine herself was offering encouragement for the dangerous journey ahead. They waited until well past midnight, before beginning their descent into the castle's foundations. Thomas had spent the evening gathering equipment: rope, oil lamps, tools for breaking through potential barriers, and a camera belonging to Sarah's legal firm for documenting whatever they might find. Lady Catherine's mechanical compass led them to a section of the castle's lowest level that Eleanor had never fully explored. Here, beneath what had once been servants' quarters, The walls changed from medieval stonework to something far older. Massive blocks fitted together with the precision that marked Roman construction. "The entrance should be here," Eleanor whispered, consulting Lady Catherine's notes by lamplight. The compass needle pointed steadily toward a section of wall that looked identical to everything around it. Thomas ran his hands along the ancient stones, searching for irregularities. "There," he said finally. "This block is slightly recessed from the others. And look, there's a small depression in the center. Just the right size for—" Eleanor pressed the family seal ring into the depression. The fit was perfect, as if the signet had been designed specifically for this purpose. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a grinding sound that spoke of mechanisms preserved by Roman engineering, the massive stone began to move. The block pivoted inward, revealing darkness beyond that their lamps couldn't fully penetrate. A breath of air emerged from the opening. Not the stale atmosphere Eleanor had expected, but something fresher, suggesting ventilation systems that still functioned after 2 millennia. "Remarkable," Lady Margaret breathed. "The Romans built this to last forever." Thomas entered first, holding his lamp high to illuminate what lay ahead. "There's a staircase," he reported, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. Stone steps leading down, with handholds carved into the walls. The construction is perfect. No settling. No damage that I can see. They descended in single file, Eleanor clutching the family ring that had proven to be the key to her ancestors' greatest secret. The staircase was longer than expected, dropping what felt like 50 feet before opening into a chamber that took their breath away. The vault was vast, a circular room perhaps 60 feet in diameter, its domed ceiling supported by graceful arches that seemed to glow in their lamplight. But it was the contents of the chamber that made them gasp with wonder. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with scrolls, bound volumes, and metal tablets arranged with meticulous care. At the room's center stood a series of stone pedestals holding objects that gleamed with precious metals and gems. Not decorative items, but instruments whose purpose was clearly scientific or technical. "This isn't just a library," Sarah whispered in amazement. "It's a complete repository of Roman technological knowledge." Eleanor approached the nearest shelf with reverent care. The scrolls were protected by metal cases that had preserved them perfectly, and the bound volumes were written on vellum that showed no signs of decay. Inscriptions in Latin identified treatises on concrete formulation, aqueduct engineering, road construction techniques, and architectural principles. Thomas was examining the instruments on the pedestals. "These are surveying tools, but far more sophisticated than anything I've seen. This device appears to measure angles and distances with incredible precision. And this one," he paused, studying a complex arrangement of gears and dials. "I think it's for calculating structural loads in buildings." Lady Margaret had discovered something even more extraordinary in an alcove near the back of the chamber. "Eleanor, come see this. It's a complete architectural model." The model showed a Roman city, in miniature, with every building, street, and infrastructure system represented in perfect detail. Tiny aqueducts carried actual water through the model, demonstrating engineering principles that were still being discovered in the 19th century. "It's not just knowledge," Eleanor realized with growing excitement. "It's a working laboratory where Roman engineers tested their innovations before applying them to full-scale construction." Sarah was busy photographing everything, her camera's flash illuminating details that lamplight couldn't reveal clearly. "This is the archaeological discovery of the century. These preservation techniques, this level of organization. It surpasses anything found at Pompeii or Herculaneum." As Eleanor explored deeper into the vault, she found evidence that the chamber had been used long after the Roman Empire fell. Medieval editions showed that subsequent generations had continued adding to the collection, preserving knowledge across centuries of political upheaval. In a final chamber connected to the main vault, Eleanor discovered Lady Catherine's most recent contributions. Her botanical research was here, but enhanced by Roman techniques for plant cultivation that modern science had forgotten. Ancient methods for soil improvement were combined with Victorian innovations in chemistry, creating agricultural advances that could indeed revolutionize farming worldwide. "She brought her work here to complete it," Eleanor breathed, reading her great-aunt's final journal entries by lamplight. She understood that her innovations were part of a continuous tradition of knowledge that stretched back thousands of years. Thomas found evidence of the vault's sophisticated preservation. Systems: air circulation driven by natural convection, moisture control through mineral absorption, and temperature regulation that, maintained perfect conditions for preserving both organic and inorganic materials. We could study this place for decades and still not understand everything it contains, he said with awe. But their time was limited. Even as they documented the vault's contents, Eleanor was aware that morning would bring Reginald's deadline and the consortium's threatened violence. They needed enough evidence to convince authorities that the vault deserved legal protection, but they also needed to escape before their enemies realized what they had discovered. "We have enough photographs to prove the vault's significance," Sarah announced after 2 hours of systematic documentation. "This evidence will convince any court that the site deserves immediate archaeological protection." As they prepared to leave the vault, Eleanor took one last look at the accumulated wisdom of ages. She understood now why Lady Catherine had been so careful about protecting the castle's secrets, why she had spent her fortune maintaining everything until the right person could claim the inheritance. The family seal ring had been more than a symbol of ownership. It had been the key to knowledge that could benefit humanity for generations if used wisely, or cause incalculable damage if exploited by those who valued profit over progress. Eleanor sealed the vault behind them, knowing that when they emerged into the castle above, they would be carrying evidence that would change not just her own fate, but the future of archaeological preservation throughout Europe. Dawn was breaking over Ravenshollow as Eleanor, Thomas, Sarah, and Lady Margaret emerged from the vault with evidence that would change everything. But their triumph was short-lived. From the castle's upper windows, they could see carriages approaching along the drive, more vehicles than Reginald had brought for his previous visit. "The consortium," Lady Margaret said grimly. "They're not waiting for the deadline." Sarah quickly secured the photographs in a waterproof case, recognizing that the evidence they had gathered represented the only chance of protecting the vault from exploitation. "We need to get these to London immediately. My legal colleagues are waiting to file emergency injunctions the moment they receive proof of the site's archaeological significance." Thomas was studying the approaching convoy through a spyglass. 8 men, possibly more. "They're armed and they're not trying to hide it. This isn't a legal proceeding, it's a raid." Eleanor felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. The knowledge they had discovered in the vault belonged to humanity, not to a consortium of grave robbers who would exploit it for commercial gain. But protecting it would require more courage than she had ever been called upon to display. "Sarah, take the photographs and leave immediately," Eleanor commanded, her voice carrying an authority that would have amazed her former employers. "Use the servants' entrance and make your way to the village. Thomas's mother will hide you until you can reach the London train." "I won't abandon you," Sarah protested. "We face this together. You face this by ensuring the evidence survives, regardless of what happens to the rest of us." Eleanor was surprised by her own calm in the face of approaching danger. "The photographs are more important than any individual. They're the only thing standing between priceless knowledge and those who would destroy it for profit." Lady Margaret stepped forward, her expression resolute. "Eleanor is right, but she won't face this alone. I've been protecting Catherine's legacy for 30 years. I won't stop now." Thomas moved to Eleanor's side, his presence solid and reassuring. "And I've spent my life maintaining this castle. I'm not leaving while it needs defending." As Sarah departed through the servants' quarters with the precious photographs, Eleanor, Thomas, and Lady Margaret positioned themselves in the great hall to receive their unwelcome visitors. Eleanor wore Lady Catherine's finest dress, which she had found preserved in the tower chamber, and the family seal ring caught morning light streaming. Through the tall windows, Reginald arrived with what was clearly a private army, men whose military bearing and modern weapons spoke of professional mercenaries rather than legal representatives. But it was the figure who accompanied them that made Eleanor's blood run cold. The man was perhaps 60, with silver hair and clothing that spoke of immense wealth. His eyes held the calculating coldness of someone accustomed to buying whatever he desired, including people's lives and loyalties. "Miss Hartwell," Reginald said, his voice tight with nervous energy, "allow me to present Baron von Habsburg, my principal investor. The Baron has traveled from Vienna specifically to discuss the future of this property." The Baron stepped forward with the casual arrogance of someone who had never been denied anything he truly wanted. "Miss Hartwell, I trust you have reconsidered your position regarding this inheritance dispute. My associates have prepared a very generous settlement that would compensate you handsomely for any inconvenience." Eleanor drew herself to her full height, channeling every bit of aristocratic bearing she had observed during her years in service. "Baron, you are trespassing on my property with what appears to be a private military force. I suggest you leave immediately before I summon the authorities." The Baron's laugh was genuinely amused. "My dear child, I am the authorities in this matter. Several magistrates in this region owe their positions to my influence, and the local constabulary has been informed that we are conducting a legitimate archaeological survey with all proper permissions." Lady Margaret stepped forward, her own aristocratic bearing matching the Baron's. "And I am Lady Margaret Thornfield, with connections that extend far beyond Yorkshire magistrates. Any violence committed here will be reported directly to the Home Office, with full documentation of your criminal conspiracy." For the first time, the Baron's confidence seemed to waver slightly. "Lady Thornfield, your reputation precedes you. I had hoped we might avoid involving someone of your influence in this matter." "Too late for that consideration," Lady Margaret replied coldly. "You've chosen to threaten someone under my protection, which means you've chosen to make an enemy of everyone who values justice over profit." Thomas moved protectively closer to Eleanor, his blacksmith's frame representing the only physical defense they could muster against the Baron's mercenaries. "Perhaps you should reconsider who you're threatening, Baron. This woman has more support than you realize." The Baron gestured impatiently, clearly tired of negotiation. "Enough discussion. Mr. Hartwell, your services are no longer required. My men will secure the property while my experts begin their archaeological survey." Reginald's face went white as he realized he was being dismissed. "But we had an agreement. The inheritance was to be mine once you gained access to the vault." "Your agreement was with representatives who lacked authority to make binding commitments," the Baron replied with casual cruelty. "You were useful for establishing legal pretext, but that usefulness has expired." Eleanor watched with mixture of sympathy and disgust as Reginald realized he had been manipulated from the beginning. His dreams of wealth and status were crumbling as he understood that he had been nothing more than a pawn in the Baron's larger game. "You can't do this," Reginald protested desperately. "I have documents, legal standing, proof of my claim." One of the Baron's mercenaries stepped forward with obvious menace, and Reginald backed away, finally understanding the true nature of the people he had chosen as allies. Eleanor felt a moment of unexpected pity for her cousin, despite everything he had done. "Reginald, it's not too late to choose the right side. Help us protect what belongs to history, not to those who would exploit it." For a moment she thought he might accept her offer, but fear and greed had corrupted his judgment too completely. Instead of joining them, he retreated toward the door, abandoning even the pretense of courage. The Baron watched his departure with indifference before turning back to Eleanor. "Now then, Miss Hartwell, shall we discuss this reasonably? I'm prepared to offer you a very comfortable life in exchange for cooperation with my archaeological research." Eleanor lifted her chin defiantly, the family seal ring catching sunlight like a beacon of defiance. "Baron von Habsburg, this castle and everything beneath it belongs to the ages, not to grave robbers masquerading as scholars. You'll have to take it by force." The Baron's smile was cold as winter. "That can be arranged." What happened next would have seemed impossible if Eleanor hadn't witnessed it herself. As the Baron's mercenaries advanced toward them with clear intent to seize control of the castle, the Great Hall's massive doors burst open to admit what appeared to be half the village of Ravenshollow. Thomas's father led the group, carrying the hammer from his forge like a weapon of war. Behind him came Mrs. Pemberton with a rolling pin that looked capable of inflicting serious damage, old Pete wielding a pitchfork despite his advanced age, and dozens of other villagers armed with everything from kitchen knives to farming implements. But it was the figure following them that made Eleanor's heart soar with hope. Sarah had returned, and she was not alone. A man in official uniform accompanied her, someone whose bearing and authority made the Baron's mercenaries hesitate despite their superior weapons. "I am Inspector Morrison of Her Majesty's Archaeological Commission," the newcomer announced, his voice carrying the weight of royal authority. "By order of the Crown, this site is now under official protection pending investigation of claims regarding its historical significance." Sarah stepped forward, holding up the waterproof case containing their photographs. "Inspector, I present evidence that Ravenshollow Castle sits above the most significant Roman archaeological discovery in British history. The vault beneath this structure contains preserved engineering, knowledge that predates anything previously discovered in the Empire." The Baron's confident expression wavered as he realized the situation had shifted dramatically. "This is preposterous. I have legitimate salvage rights, legally obtained permits, and full authority to conduct archaeological surveys on this property." Inspector Morrison examined documents that Sarah produced from her case, official papers bearing seals and signatures that spoke of influence extending far beyond Yorkshire. "Baron, your permits have been suspended pending investigation of irregularities in their issuance. Several magistrates involved in approving your documentation are now under investigation for accepting bribes." Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude toward Lady Margaret, whose connections had clearly reached the highest levels of government. The older woman stepped forward with quiet dignity. "Inspector Morrison, I believe you'll find that Baron von Habsburg's archaeological surveys have systematically looted historical sites across Europe. The knowledge he seeks to claim belongs to humanity, not to private collectors willing to pay premium prices for stolen artifacts." The Baron was clearly calculating his options. His mercenaries outnumbered by angry villagers and faced with official government authority. "This is merely a temporary setback," he said coldly. "I have resources and connections that extend far beyond British jurisdiction." "Perhaps," Inspector Morrison replied calmly, "but you no longer have access to this site. Any attempts to remove materials or conduct unauthorized excavations will be treated as crimes against the Crown." Thomas moved to Eleanor's side, his presence warm and reassuring as they watched their enemy's plans crumble. "How did you manage to bring half the village?" he asked quietly. Eleanor smiled, understanding finally dawning. They weren't protecting me, she realized. They were protecting their heritage. This castle, this knowledge, it belongs to the community that has preserved it for generations. Mrs. Pemberton approached with tears in her eyes. "Miss Hartwell, my grandmother used to tell stories about the castle's secrets, about knowledge that would someday help the world. When Sarah told us what you'd found, we knew we couldn't let strangers steal what our families have been guarding for centuries." Old Pete nodded vigorously despite his age. "Lady Catherine always said the castle would know when the right person came to claim it. You're that person, miss. We're not letting anyone take what belongs to you by right." The Baron realized that his carefully planned raid had become a public spectacle with government oversight and community opposition. His mercenaries, faced with official authority and overwhelming local support, were no longer an effective threat. "This isn't finished," the Baron warned as he prepared to withdraw. "I have considerable resources and very long patience. You've won today, but the war for that knowledge is far from over." Eleanor stepped forward, the family seal ring catching light as she raised her hand. "Baron, you misunderstand what you're fighting. This knowledge doesn't belong to any individual. It belongs to humanity." Lady Catherine understood that, which is why she preserved it rather than exploiting it. "I intend to honor her vision." As the Baron and his men departed, Eleanor turned to address the villagers who had risked their safety to protect her inheritance. "Thank you," she said simply. "Not just for today, but for generations of guardianship that made this moment possible." Inspector Morrison approached with official papers that would establish the vault's legal protection. "Miss Hartwell, the Crown is prepared to designate this site as a protected archaeological treasure, with you serving as its official curator. The position comes with substantial resources for proper study and preservation." Eleanor felt the weight of responsibility and opportunity settling on her shoulders. She would never again be the invisible governess watching other people's lives from the shadows. Instead, she would be the guardian of knowledge that could benefit the world for generations to come. Thomas took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers as they stood together in the great hall surrounded by friends and allies. "Are you ready for this?" he asked quietly. Eleanor looked around at the faces of people who had become her community, her family in ways that blood alone could never create. Lady Margaret smiled with maternal pride. Sarah beamed with professional satisfaction, and the villagers who had defended her inheritance waited to hear how she would use the gifts she had received. "I've spent my entire life preparing for this," Eleanor realized. "I just didn't know it until now." The family seal ring felt warm against her finger as she contemplated the future stretching ahead, a future where love and knowledge could flourish together, where the wisdom of ages could serve the needs of generations yet unborn, and where a former governess could become the guardian of humanity's greatest treasures. 5 years had passed since that dramatic morning when Eleanor's world changed forever. The great hall of Ravenshollow Castle now bustled with activity that Lady Catherine could never have imagined. Scholars from across Europe studying the Roman vault's treasures, agricultural students learning techniques that combined ancient wisdom with modern innovation, and visitors from around the world marveling at what had become known as the Hartwell collection. Eleanor stood at the tall windows of what had once been Lady Catherine's private study, watching Thomas demonstrate Roman concrete formulation to a group of engineers from London. His expertise had grown remarkably over the years, transforming him from a village blacksmith into one of England's leading authorities on historical construction techniques. The university had awarded him an honorary degree, but he still maintained his forge in the village, teaching traditional metalworking alongside his archaeological work. The morning correspondence. "Lady Eleanor," announced Mrs. Davies, the efficient secretary who now managed the castle's educational programs. Eleanor still felt a flutter of surprise at the formal title, though she had legally claimed it along with all her other inheritances. Among the letters was one bearing familiar handwriting. Sarah, now a prominent barrister in London, writing to confirm her attendance at next month's celebration. The Hartwell Institute for Historical Preservation was marking its 5th anniversary, and Sarah had been instrumental in establishing the legal frameworks that protected archaeological sites throughout Britain. Another letter came from Lady Margaret, who had become Eleanor's closest advisor in managing the complex business empire that Lady Catherine's innovations continued to generate. The botanical patents were more profitable than ever, with applications in agriculture and medicine, providing steady income that funded the Institute's research and educational programs. But it was the third letter that brought the deepest satisfaction. A note from Professor Heinrich Zimmermann of Vienna University, thanking Eleanor for access to the Roman engineering texts that had revolutionized bridge construction across Central Europe. The knowledge preserved in the vault was proving as valuable as Lady Catherine had hoped, serving humanity rather than enriching private collectors. Eleanor made her way to the conservatory, which had been expanded into a remarkable greenhouse complex where ancient Roman agricultural techniques were being combined with Lady Catherine's botanical innovations. The results were spectacular. Crops that produced twice normal yields while requiring half the water, flowers that bloomed year-round in England's harsh climate, and medicinal plants whose properties had been enhanced through careful breeding programs. She found Thomas in the main greenhouse, explaining soil chemistry to a group of visiting farmers whose own lands had benefited from the Institute's freely shared discoveries. His face lit up when he saw her approaching, the same warm smile that had first caught her attention years ago in his village forge. "Perfect timing," he said, wrapping an arm around her waist with casual affection that still made her heart flutter. "I was just explaining how your great-aunt's preservation techniques work with Roman mineral supplements to extend growing seasons." Eleanor listened with pride as Thomas described innovations that were transforming agriculture across Britain. The knowledge Lady Catherine had hoarded out of caution was now benefiting thousands of farmers, just as she had secretly hoped it might when the right person came to claim her legacy. That evening, as the day's visitors departed and the castle grew quiet, Eleanor and Thomas walked through the portrait gallery where their love story had truly begun. The paintings seemed friendlier now, as if approving of the life Eleanor had built within these ancient walls. "Any regrets?" Thomas asked, a question he posed occasionally, as if still unable to believe their fairy tale had become reality. Eleanor considered the question seriously. Her life bore no resemblance to anything she could have imagined during those years of invisible service in other people's houses. She was now a woman of property and influence, married to a man whose love and respect had never wavered, despite the vast changes in her circumstances. "Only one," she said finally. "I regret that Lady Catherine couldn't see what her legacy became. She would have been amazed by how many people have benefited from her work." Thomas smiled, pulling her closer as they stood beneath Lady Catherine's portrait. "I think she knew exactly what would happen. Why else would she have preserved everything so carefully, chosen you so specifically?" Eleanor looked up at her great-aunt's painted face, remembering that first night when she had felt Lady Catherine's presence encouraging her exploration. Perhaps some kinds of love truly did transcend death, continuing to work through those left behind to accomplish what the deceased had only dreamed of achieving. "Mrs. Eleanor Ashford," Thomas said softly, using the name that still thrilled her with its implications of belonging and permanence. "You've become everything Lady Catherine hoped you would be." Eleanor leaned into his embrace, feeling the contentment that came from knowing her purpose in the world. She was no longer the governess watching other people's lives from the shadows. She had become the woman she was meant to be, a guardian of knowledge, a teacher of wisdom, a bridge between past discoveries and future possibilities. The family seal ring caught moonlight streaming through the gallery windows, its carved rose seeming to bloom with ethereal beauty. Eleanor understood now that inheritance was not simply about receiving what others had accumulated, but about having the vision and courage to transform gifts into legacies that would endure long after any individual life had ended. Through the castle's windows, she could see lights twinkling in the village below, families gathered around their own hearths, living lives made richer by knowledge that had once been hidden in ancient vaults and forgotten laboratories. This was Lady Catherine's true legacy, not wealth or property, but the understanding that wisdom belonged to everyone, and that sometimes the greatest treasures were those shared freely, rather than hoarded selfishly. Eleanor smiled, knowing that her own story was far from finished. Tomorrow would bring new scholars, new discoveries, new opportunities to transform the past's gifts into the future's possibilities. She had found her home, her love, and her purpose in the same magnificent inheritance, proving that sometimes the most unexpected journeys lead to the most perfect destinations.